Good evening and welcome everybody. I'm Fiona Eadie and I'm President of FDA, and I'm extremely proud to be President during this, our centenary year. We've had a number of events throughout the course of this year to mark and celebrate our centenary, and I'm delighted tonight to welcome you to our first centenary lecture. As part of our centenary celebrations, we embarked upon some research to explore the history of our union. That revealed a treasure trove of information about our roots. We very proudly discovered that we were one of the first trade unions to have a woman as chair, with Dame Alex Kilroy becoming elected to lead FDA as far back as 1944. Even before that, it was clear that equality, and particularly the rights of women in the workplace, were a priority for FDA from the beginning. We were one of the first unions to begin the battle for equal pay, with our first challenge lodged in 1924, a fight that unfortunately we're still having to take on behalf of members today. More recently, we charted the rise of one of my favourite events, the Women into Leadership conferences, established by the FDA 10 years ago to help women progress in their careers, and now reaching over 3,000 women each year across the country. The FDA is still championing women and their outstanding contribution to the civil service. And chairing these events, it really is one of my highlights of my calendar. With such a rich history of championing equality, we wanted to mark our centenary with a positive commitment to the future. And we looked to find a partner of a calibre that would complement and further the work that we do to support women. And we found that here in the Global Institute at King's College London. This partnership is the collaboration of two organisations who are driving for change in a positive way, something we've already evidenced with our new research released today on the reality of working flexibly in the civil service. This is an issue important to all our members, not just women, and our recommendations will help the civil service in its goal to become the most inclusive employer by 2020. I'm delighted to formally announce our partnership with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership this evening. And what a way to do it. We'll shortly be hearing from Julia Gillard, the first and to this day only female Prime Minister of Australia, a position she held from 2010 to 2013. You might remember Julia's October 2012 speech to Parliament on the treatment of women in professional and public life. We're delighted to hear from her tonight and to hear more about her views on gender equality and how we truly get there. In addition to our fantastic speaker, we're also thrilled to be joined by Antonia Romeo, Civil Service Gender Champion and Permanent Secretary at the Department for International Trade. Antonia joined the civil service in 2000 as a professional economist and worked across a number of roles, including in the Ministry of Justice and the Cabinet Office, before taking on her current role at DIT. After Julia has spoken, Antonia will be leading a conversation with Julia, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her perspective on how women can develop in leadership, particularly within the civil service. Thanks to the wonders of modern technology, we're also live streaming this event. We have a contingent in Edinburgh who have arranged a screening, so hello to my colleagues in Scotland. And we have a live link available for members to watch along to. But you can get involved in the conversation both here in the room, because we have built-in time, obviously, to take questions from you in the audience. And for those following on Twitter, you can ask your questions of Julia with the hashtag FDA Julia Gillard. So without further ado, can I please welcome Julia Gillard to deliver our first centenary lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it is a great pleasure to be here to celebrate this important event, 100 years of the FDA. Happy birthday. The Association of First Division Civil Servants came into being in January 1919, just after the horror of World War I came to an end. On that day, the civil servants who formed your union would have been forgiven for thinking that what lay ahead was an era of peace and prosperity, with humanity having learned the lesson from the so-called war to end all wars. Sadly, as we know, more war lay ahead, and before it, the poverty of the Great Depression. But so too did some of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Growing life expectancy, plummeting infant mortality, greater education levels, incredible new technologies, and, dare I say it, the amazing sight of the former combatants within Europe coming together to form a union dedicated to being united in diversity. While none of the founders of the FDA had a good enough crystal ball to foresee all of this, they were undoubtedly right about two big truths which have endured unchanged over 100 years. First, that working people, whatever their occupation, are better off because of trade unionism. I was taught to believe that in my family home, especially by my Welsh father, who grew up in a coal mining village. If I was ever asked what our family religion was when I was a child, I gave the technically correct answer that we were Baptist, but in truth, our religion was union. As an adult, you necessarily reevaluate some of the learned certainties of your youth, but my belief in trade unionism has never wavered. Indeed, it's been reinforced by the modern phenomenon of rising inequality and wage stagnation. So those who created this union 100 years ago gave subsequent generations, including today's, a great gift, to be cherished and nurtured by the new leaders and activists that step forward in every era. Second, your founders in 1919 were right to believe that a strong, independent, professional civil service is one of the foundation stones of a mature and functioning democracy. In this era of fake news, alternative facts, populism and spin, the clarity of frank and fearless civil service advice based on evidence has never been more needed. Unfortunately, it's also never been harder to give. Gone is the long-held convention that civil servants were the unseen advisors while the politicians entered the fray. Now a civil servant can find themselves named, shamed, and in the middle of a Twitterverse storm, all for just doing their jobs to the best of their ability. In these moments, whatever your faith, it is wise to remember the biblical words, "Have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" The answer must be a resounding no. It is actually only the best friends that can be relied upon to be consistent truth tellers. So it is with today's civil service. Your fortitude is being honest and patient in a world of fast falsehoods and impatience, and that fortitude is to be admired. There must be many days when the new demands of you in today's world seem overwhelming. Understanding this, King's College has recently established a world-leading international school for government, which is accessible and contemporary. It provides online master's level modules for civil servants in particular, which address many of the main issues that confront governments today. It may be of use to a number of you. But generally, I start tonight by congratulating you for keeping true to the communal spirit that enables working people to come together in solidarity, and for continuing to believe and exhibit through your day-to-day work that standing up for facts and evidence-based policy making should never go out of style. Over the FDA's 100 years, feminism has also seen its share of triumphs. At the time your union started, the first wave of feminism, which focused on achieving female suffrage, was still engulfing the world. The second wave of the 1960s and 1970s brought us new understandings about how the personal is political, as well as the initial rounds of legislated protections against discrimination and in favour of equal pay. The third feminist wave of the 1990s taught us much about the compounding pressures like gender, race, ethnicity, class and sexuality. Much has been won, and we should celebrate each and every achievement and each and every feminist hero and male ally who helped bring about change. But all that effort has given us a world in which we still face profound challenges. In today's world, globally, women make up just 9% of senior IT leaders, 23% of national parliamentarians, 25% of senior managers, 26% of news media leaders, 27% of judges. Now, these statistics might trouble us less if the rate of change in them was rapid. Unfortunately, it's actually glacial. The World Economic Forum estimates that at current rates of change, it will take 202 and 107 years respectively to close the gaps between women and men in economic and political empowerment. Now, I think I do a reasonable job of eating my veggies, but I am turning 58 on Sunday, and I think it's quite unlikely I'm going to make it to 260, so we do need to get a move on. However, in the civil service, whilst a microcosm of these global trends, is doing better than most, so congratulations to you on that. Although overall the civil service is 53% female, the representation of women does drop off as you rise to just 43% in the senior civil service. But admirably, there's been an 11 percentage point increase in the last 10 years. However, there is greater equality in the senior ranks in traditionally female areas like education, housing and communities, health and social care, and greater disparity in traditionally male areas like the Cabinet Office and Defence, amongst others. So there is still work to do. Understanding these kinds of statistics and having a passion for changing them has led King's College London to create the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, which I'm proud to chair. Our goal is to contribute to creating a world in which being a woman is not a barrier to being a leader in any field or a factor leading to negative perceptions of an individual's leadership. You may be thinking the Global Institute sounds like a great idea, but why would a former Australian Prime Minister be commuting to and from Adelaide to be part of it? The answer is, I left my period in politics with a thirst to understand more about the evidence around women's leadership. Personally, I'd lived through some strange, even searing experiences. It's not easy to try and crystallise those into a few words, but I'll endeavour to give you some sense of how it all felt. Sometimes it felt lonely. I was so visibly the oddity. As Prime Minister, day after day, time after time, I would find myself in a room, often a business boardroom, where I was the only woman, apart perhaps from a woman serving food or coffee. Because politics at senior levels in my nation had almost always been the pursuit of men, the assumption of politics had been defined around men's lives, not women's lives. It's assumed a man with children brings to politics the perspective of a family man, but it's never suggested that he should be disqualified from the rigours of political life because he has caring responsibilities. This definitely does not work the same for women. Even before becoming Prime Minister, I'd observed that if you are a woman politician, it is impossible to win on the question of family. If you do not have children, and I don't, then you are characterised as out of touch with mainstream life. If you do have children, then heavens, who's looking after them as you run round being a politician? I was chided by a senior Conservative senator for being deliberately barren, and then had to stomach reading follow-up pieces like the one entitled Barren Behaviour in one of our 2 national newspapers, which stated, and I quote, "At the Junee Abattoir, manager Heath Newton knows what happens in the bush to a barren cow. It's just a case where if they're infertile, they get sent to the vet to get checked and then killed as hamburger mince," he says. In the Kimberley region near Broome, where the Conservative senator issued his public apology for his remarks, the barren cows even have a name: killers. It's the ultimate fate of an animal that can't breed. Before becoming Prime Minister, I'd also worked out that what you were wearing will draw disproportionate attention. But it is still galling to me that when I first met NATO's leader, predominantly to discuss our strategy for the war in Afghanistan, where our troops were fighting and dying, it was reported in the following terms: the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, has made her first appearance on the international stage, meeting the head of NATO, Andres Rasmussen, in Brussels. Dressed in a white short jacket and dark trousers, she arrived at the security organisation's headquarters just after 9 a.m. European time and was ushered in by Mr Rasmussen, the former Danish Prime Minister and NATO's Secretary-General. This article was written by a female journalist, and it apparently went without saying that Mr Rasmussen was wearing a suit. This gender stereotyping was at the very benign end compared to much of what I faced. Ditch the witch on placards at rallies, the ugly ravings about how women are destroying the joint from a conservative and cantankerous radio shock jock, the pornographic cartoons circulated by an eccentric bankrupt, the vile words on social media. In my last speech as Prime Minister, I said, gender doesn't explain everything about my Prime Ministership. It doesn't explain nothing. It explains some things, and it is for the nation to think in a sophisticated way about these shades of grey. I've taken to joking that given the book and the movie, I wish I'd used an expression other than shades of grey. But I am still urging sophisticated thinking, and that is what has led me to working with a fantastic team at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. At the Institute, we conceptualise our work as being not so much about the glass ceiling as the glass labyrinth. By that we mean that we want to look at a woman's working life journey from the moment she starts employment and change every point where she is treated differently or in a lesser way than a man. In pursuing our work, we often find that we are working with leaders of organisations who are persuaded of the case for change, have implemented reforms to dismantle the most obvious barriers for women, but are still not seeing the deep degree of improvement they want. Or put another way, achieving gender equality at work is complicated, and even the most well-intentioned changes can have unforeseen impacts. In collaboration with the FDA, we are proud to have been involved in a research project that surfaces some of the very complexities that we all need to face. My congratulations to your union on deciding to undertake this work and for partnering with my colleague Laura Jones to jointly produce such an exemplary report. The study is a deep dive into issues surrounding flexible work. As you would be aware, the civil service is openly committed to becoming the most inclusive employer in the UK by 2020 and has put flexible working at the centre of its plans to encourage diversity and inclusion. There is an implicit assumption in this commitment that flexible work will be, if not a panacea, at least a big contributor to enabling those with responsibilities outside work to balance work and life. Another embedded assumption is that these flexibilities are really for women because of their disproportionate role in caring for children and performing domestic labour. In entitling the report Flexible Working, Myth or Reality, we are invited to question each of these assumptions. The power of this work stems from the fact that answers were sought not from external experts, but from civil servants themselves. At every stage, it is a lived reality that is front and centre. What came through loud and clear is that flexible work is going to be stigmatised if it is seen as the mummy track. If it is only women who work flexibly, then it becomes almost irresistible for workplaces to view their workforce as divided into the majority group of standard hours workers and the minority group who work differently. Failing to then include the minority group in workplace training, promotions opportunities, and the many ties that bind colleagues together as a team becomes the easy default position. This is best overcome, as the report recommends, by making flexible work truly available to all. All jobs that can be worked flexibly should be advertised as such, with rare exceptions justified based on business need. Now, in making such a recommendation, at the Global Institute, we are not naive about the disproportionate way in which caring and domestic work falls onto the shoulders of women. University of Melbourne academic Cordelia Fine has done some wonderful work showing exactly how all this plays out for women, concluding that even in dual career families where both parents work full-time, domestic work is unevenly distributed. In a study of couples who were both academics, Cordelia finds female faculty with children working 51 hours a week at their jobs and then work another 51 hours a week doing housework and childcare, truly the second shift. That's a 102-hour working week, accounting for more than 14 hours per day. Cordelia goes on, add to this 8 hours per day for sleeping, an hour for eating and basic hygiene, and by my calculations, that leaves these women the grand total of 26 minutes a day to themselves. Faculty fathers, by contrast, put in only 32 unpaid hours work a week. This substantially lighter load not only enables them to put in an extra 5 hours a week at work, but also to enjoy a spare 2 hours a day. Cordelia cheekily concludes, behind every great academic man there is a woman, but behind every academic woman is an unpeeled potato and a child who needs some attention. As well as advocating flexible work for all, we should keep making the necessary arguments about fairer sharing of domestic work. If flexible work becomes the norm for all, that will assist men in stepping up to greater domestic responsibilities. Once an arrangement has been struck around flexible work that meets the needs of the individual civil servant and the employer, understandably, the employee will want to lock it in. If such flexibilities are not going to be replicated in other positions, then that creates a labour mobility problem. An individual civil servant may desperately want to move to take up a new challenge or seek promotion, but be dissuaded from doing so if they have to start again in seeking the flexibilities they need. To overcome this potential rigidity, which both frustrates employees and denies the civil service the ability to get its best talent into the most appropriate roles, it is recommended that a working passport that allows people to take their alternative arrangements to new roles should be designed. In our engagement with employers at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, one of the most common problems encountered is the gap between the wonderful employment policies contained in glossy brochures and what actually happens on the ground. For individual employees, what can matter more to their day-to-day reality is the attitudes and predispositions of their line managers rather than the formal words of the workplace policies. Of course, this kind of variability can lead to tremendous differences, with people in similar circumstances treated very differently. To overcome this kind of unfairness, the report recommends that training is made available for line managers on how to support flexible and part-time workers. Even when the team manager is fantastic, your members stated that they can feel shamed for working flexibly by other members of their team. This is a difficult problem to resolve. It is easy for standard hours workers to conclude that they will be required to pick up the slack if a person in the team is absent or visibly packing up their stuff to leave at lunchtime. Expressions like shirking from home are all too common. In part, the spread of flexible working will help address this in and of itself. But the report also calls for the taking of a team approach to flexible working in order to create a positive culture that ensures awareness of the work-life balance of everyone in the team. Somewhat ironically, given these perceptions, those working flexibly reported in this research that workloads are too high and stressful. It appears that on many occasions, managers agree to an employee going part-time or working compressed hours without in any way adjusting workloads. This means the person working flexibly can be hit with the double whammy of being made to feel like they are not pulling their weight by their colleagues, while in reality, the impact of their workload on their life has never been higher. To avoid this kind of result, the report recommends that upon adopting a flexible working pattern, an evaluation of the role should be undertaken to ensure that it is appropriately weighted. There is a reason that the saying, out of sight, out of mind, has been so commonly used throughout the ages and still has meaning today. The research work makes it clear that it is easy for employers who have the responsibility of completing performance assessments to mark down part-time or flexible workers. Overcoming this kind of default bias can be done by tracking trends and working through issues if a particular manager consistently underrates those who are not full-time in the office. A commonplace but more recent saying is, you can't be what you can't see. For cultures around part-time and flexible work to really take hold, it will be vital for people who work in this way to become leaders and role models. It is one thing for a young civil servant to be told that you will not suffer any career detriment if you work flexibly. It is quite another and far more persuasive if she or he can see senior civil servants who got to the top while working in that way. Finally, and a particular hobby horse of mine, the report recommends that there should be acceptance that despite constant access to IT, staff are not available to work all hours. IT etiquette should be created and publicised to ensure that a culture of contact outside normal working hours does not become the norm. I'm personally attached to this recommendation, but from a different perspective than the way in which it undermines flexible work. Rather, I personally prioritise it because of the way too much activity undermines deep strategic thinking. Every day in human history has brought with it the struggle to manage the tension between getting the urgent done and finding time for the important, doing immediately what matters in this 15 minutes versus finding the time to do today what will matter most in 5, 10 and 20 years' time. While this dilemma has always been with us, never has the urgent been more privileged in commanding our attention over the important. Today's technology means the urgent can ping and vibrate at us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In this crowded, contested world, having the discipline to carve out time to do the important has never been harder and never mattered more. I tried to, as Prime Minister, frequently retreating into what I described as the cone of silence. Any watchers of Get Smart will get that reference. But looking back on my days in office, I now realise that the time I carved out for thinking alone or scanning the far horizon with the best and brightest was not enough. I would urge getting the email warfare under control so you can aim big on this front. It will pay dividends. I am sure you can see from the summary of this report, Flexible Working, Myth or Reality, that there is now much to do and advocate for to convert worthwhile recommendations into reality. But this great union, 100 years young, is well positioned with this information to make a greater impact than solely within the civil service. With the government legislating to extend the statutory requirement to request flexible working, you can become an exemplar of what should be a norm for every workplace in the United Kingdom and beyond. This is the kind of change we must see if workplaces are to truly embrace diversity with all its benefits, and individuals are to be empowered to live the life they choose, rather than having to conform to an historic norm that is left over from the era when men worked and married women supported their husbands' careers through domestic labour. I wish you well for the campaigning to come. I thank you for your kind attention, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia, for a really brilliant and insightful talk. I've got a few questions for you, and then we're going to open it up to the floor, and we've also got some questions that are coming in on Twitter. So if you are watching on the live stream, you need to get involved with this hashtag FDA Julia Gillard. So can we start with you? Obviously, you have been a huge pioneer for women, first female Prime Minister in Australia. Did you always intend to be breaking down barriers on the way up, or is it just something that happened as you proceeded in your career?
Just something that happened, really. I grew up without a big sense of the barriers that faced women. I grew up in a migrant family where Welsh originally migrated to Australia, and there was just my sister and I. So there was no comparison in our family between the treatment of sons and the treatment of daughters. I've often wondered if my older sister had in fact been an older brother, whether that dynamic would have changed. But given there was just the two girls, and my parents had moved literally halfway around the world to give us a better start in life, we were taught to study, to aim high, to think about having careers. And so that was my kind of philosophy as I came into adulthood and into university. And then in university, that philosophy got joined to a more sophisticated understanding of feminism and the barriers that can be in women's way. But I didn't personally feel much of that until I was really at the upper echelons of politics, when it sort of reared its head, sexism and misogyny, in my view, in quite unexpected ways, and I needed to work my way through that. And now, having had that experience and looking back on it, I do feel that many women today, younger women, are much more knowing about the likely barriers ahead than I was when I was a young woman, and I think it's good to be forewarned and therefore forearmed.
So did you experience barriers and pressures in the early part of your career? I mean, obviously you've spoken a lot, and I want to talk a bit about things that happen later, but on your way up?
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly in the Labor Party, my political party is the Australian Labor Party, like all political parties in Australia at the time, probably around the world. It was disproportionately male, and our political party is in very strong partnership with the Australian trade union movement, which was also, in the era that I was starting to become active in politics, disproportionately male. So I'm of that generation of Labor women that fought for an affirmative action rule, a target, to change the dynamic that left to itself, this very male organisation, if there was a new opportunity to contest a winnable political seat, it would sort of go to the next man, because that would be the next person online and on the network, or in the line and on the network. We were led in that by a path-breaking woman called Joan Kerner, who was the first woman to lead the state of Victoria. So I knew that there were barriers and was part of that wave of breaking some of those barriers down, and we, felt more progress than we felt pushback. But we did experience pushback. At the national conference where we adopted the affirmative action rule, one of the very senior Labor male figures rushed up to one of my counterpart campaigners, a woman called Jenny, and said in a very angry tone of voice, "You bitches, you've won." Which she then grandly announced that she wants on, her gravestone. Here lies the bitch, she won. I'm not sure whether she will actually do that, but it would be an interesting moment if she did. So yes, there was pushback, but the rule got adopted. More women were coming in, so there was this sense of forward progress overwhelmingly.
You're, obviously incredibly inspiring, and you've inspired a huge number of women and men yourself. Who were your inspirational figures? You mentioned Joan Kerner, but were there other people who you thought, that's really inspiring to me, women in particular?
Yeah, certainly Joan was a close personal mentor, and that's partly because I got to know her not as some big-time aloof politician, but she was the mother of a man I went to university with. So when I first got to know her, she was sort of Dave's mum, and then she went on to be Premier of Victoria. So I had this kind of inner circle look at her life and times, and learned a lot from that. And she stayed in very close contact with me throughout my journey. Joan's sadly now passed on. In my era of early political activism, Nelson Mandela was the predominant global figure. The campaigns on universities were all about freeing Mandela, boycotting sporting tours by the Springboks and all the rest of it. So he was an iconic figure for the age. And this is, I wouldn't say mentor or figure I looked up to, but I did note with interest the election of Margaret Thatcher here. When I knew that was going to be controversial with the crowd. When she was elected in 1979, I was 18. My father's from a coal mining family, all but one of his brothers and sisters were miners or married to miners. So you could imagine the adjectives that got used before the noun Thatcher in my house. But they don't bear repeating in polite company. But it did make an impression on me that a woman could be a Prime Minister, because in Australia, we just hadn't seen that at that time, and hadn't, seen it in even the state arenas at that time.
You do a lot, Julia, to encourage women to share their stories via your podcast series. Are there any particular stories that have stood out for you from female leaders that you could share with us?
Yeah, I enjoy very much doing the podcast. We've named it a podcast of one's own because the Global Institute is in the Virginia Woolf building, because where else would you put a Global Institute for Women's Leadership? Many aspects of what women have told me in the podcast have struck me. One I think is particularly relevant this week, given the nature of some of the political debate. Carolyn Criotto Perez, who is the most recent podcast episode we've released, we talked about the times that she was campaigning to get a woman on a British pound note, Jane Austen going on the £10 note, to get a statue of a woman in the Parliamentary Square, Millicent Fawcett. And she talked about how in those periods of intense online campaigning, she would look at her social media feed and she would be getting death and rape threats at the rate of 50 an hour. And that made a big impression on me, because I think we all intellectually understand the toxicity that's online for women, but to hear a woman who at the end of the day is, they're important things, but, they're not the most controversial things in the world, I would have thought. I would have thought most people would go, that'd be a good thing, a woman on a banknote, a woman's statue. Can't see who's going to get completely threatened by that. For that kind of violence to then take hold really did make a big impression. The other thing that's made an impression on me is I've talked to women from so many different walks of life, comedians, business women, and they do have a commonality of experiences. So there is much more shared between women than sometimes on the surface we would acknowledge.
So you mentioned social media, and obviously you're a keen social media user yourself. How do you think we can use social media as a force for good in this space without just encouraging a lot of trolling and negativity?
Yeah, I am a user of social media, and in these kinds of discussions, we've got to be careful we don't just focus on the downside of it. I mean, it's a remarkable, tool for campaigning, for ideas generation, for bringing people together. I mean, it's hard now to imagine the time that we didn't have it. The old days of hand signing petitions and handing out leaflets, and I'm old enough to remember when you would type them on an IBM Electric and get them off a Romeo machine. You can see some of these instruments in museums if you choose to. It's a remarkable tool for campaigning. I do think that the social media companies have got more responsibility. I know that they are on a journey of stepping up, but I think there is an even bigger set of steps that they need to take. I couldn't design an algorithm to save my life, but I can't believe that it is beyond the wit of human beings to design these social media platforms so that the use of words like murder and rape trigger systems that take them offline before they even end up online. That's got to be doable. And if it can be done, then it ought to be done so that we can get the upside without this toxicity towards women.
So on the positive side of Twitter, you tweeted recently about real leadership going beyond confidence and charisma. Can you say something about some of the other attributes that you think real leadership requires?
Yeah, I gave a speech in Australia to the John Monash Scholarship Fund, which enables young Australians to go and study around the world, including here in the United Kingdom. And I did rely very heavily when I put that speech together about leadership today on a wonderful book by a man called Thomas Chimero Premusic, who's written a book that's entitled why are so many incompetent men leaders and how to fix it. I joked, I'm actually a Kindle user because I travel so much so I can't carry books with me, but I did joke in the speech that it would be a very good book to buy and flash around in a public space. I've got images of people in crowded, on the tube, people crowded in, and this is emblazoned on the cover. But he assembles research which basically says we're all suckers for the proposition that confident, charismatic people will be good leaders without unpacking whether confidence and charisma are actually the most important traits for leaders. And he goes through very forensically the research that shows that actually people who can be humble, daunted by the challenge, who second guess themselves, who rethink, who have doubts, these are often the better leaders than the people who, based on little knowledge but with charismatic effect, will say, let's go in this direction, only to find out when it's way too late that it's the wrong direction. So I think, the case he's making is that people are looking for humility, they're looking for empathy, the ability to marshal and nurture a team. They're looking for enabling leaders who will bring out the best in others rather than seek to enforce will on those around them. And interestingly, if we surfaced those as characteristics that we were looking for in leaders, we'd probably see less of a gender skew in who we select.
So moving on to the report, obviously big focus on flexible working, and you talked about the importance of role models and senior people who are people, men and women who are working flexibly. Do you think there are any jobs that can't be done flexibly, and how to tackle that if there are kind of particularly high pressure or difficult jobs where it's harder to organise with a flexible working pattern, or do you think that's the sort of thing we need to sweep aside?
Oh, look, I I think in some ways it depends what you mean about flexible. I mean, I find it hard to imagine jobs where you can't at least get the flexibility that comes with part-time and different kinds of hours. I mean, of course, there are jobs that have to be personal attendance for fixed hours. You know, we need firefighters who are there waiting for the call for a fixed amount of time. We need air traffic controllers who are, you know, making sure that they're there for fixed hours and attending to tasks. So the kind of flexibility one might say with picking the hours that you work, being evaluated on outcomes, being able to work from home, that can't be made available for every occupation. But even those occupations, I think, can offer, part-time and different forms of shift arrangements that give people more ability to partner what they're doing with family life. And whatever other forms of flexibilities they seek. It's not just the care of children that would mean that someone was interested in part-time or flexible work. So there's a creativity here that I think we need to bring, and a loss of, some stereotyping.
I was struck by what you said about the mummy track and the risk of, if it's only women taking up flexible working, then it will be seen as an issue for women. So, of course, you talked about making it flexible working truly available to all. How to encourage more men to take up flexible working if it were available?
Well, there are some government public policy models in this space in the sort of Nordic, Scandinavian countries, where what they've done is, in Australia, for example, you get a paid parental leave entitlement. A parent can take it. I mean, either parent can take it, but a parent takes it. And so disproportionately, the parent who takes it is the woman. In, I think it's Norway, they've made it, the public policy system one where each individual parent gets a paid parental entitlement, but they either use it or lose it. So faced with the proposition, fathers faced with the proposition that they can get a number of months paid time off or not have it, they've got no ability to transfer it to their spouse or the mother of their child. In those circumstances, men do take it. And once you start with very shared care at the earliest days of having a child, it's much more likely that you'll take shared care with you. Whereas if you start with a model that, male partner's still at work and woman is at home with the baby, then the disproportionate who's responsible for the child is likely to continue. So I think there's some good public policy models there. In terms of individual workplaces, I do think this is about leadership, and it's about men in leadership really being prepared to show that they want to model that to their workplace. And I don't mean we've had some discussions about this before at the Global Institute. I don't mean the ostentatious, the CEO sauntering through the office going, off to the school play. Did I tell you? I've got to go. I'm off to my son's school play. Not that kind of, but taking a number of months off to care for a young child, going part-time, announcing that, a day a week will be worked at home. If people see a CEO, C-suite level person, the equivalent in the public service, a senior civil servant who's a man, do that, then it will, I think, influence men down the hierarchy. My own sense is probably lots of young men in particular want to do those kind of things. They don't feel like they've got permission to say, can I do it? And so that will give them the permission.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask one last question so people can start planning their questions when I've asked this one. Obviously, it's great we've got lots of men here tonight, but also a lot of women, civil service women, so in the public sector. Do you have any tips for them on, especially perhaps people early on in their careers, but throughout their careers, on how to tackle all these issues?
Heavens, I could certainly have a lot of tips about the drafting of briefings for maximum retention by Prime Ministers at 11 p.m. at night. You know, short and clear is always better. And I could have some tips on oral briefings too. There are some people that can impart information very quickly, some people who can't. I used to have nightmares about those briefs chasing me round. But on career progression, I think it's very important for women and men, but particularly for women, to be clear on a sense of purpose about what it is that they want to achieve in their careers, in their lives. Because I think the pressures that come on women, particularly if they choose to have children in the family formation stage, are so acute that if you don't have that through line of why am I doing this, it will be very easy to get buffeted off course. I actually was advised when I became Prime Minister by Alan Milburn, who many of you might recognise the name. He was Health Secretary in Tony Blair's government and had become a friend through Labor networks. He advised me to sort of write out on a sheet of paper the purpose of the government I led, and I did do that, and I did carry it around with me, and it was enormously steadying when you thought that you could be pushed off course. And I think it's that kind of clarity about what it is you're trying to do that helps you maintain the continuity day after day, year after year, when just the randomness of today's world can really buffet you around.
Excellent, thank you very much. Let's take some questions from the floor. We've got some roving mics. So perhaps if you can put your hand up and then maybe say your name and which department you're from, just so you get a sense. Should we take this lady here first? Thank you.
Hi, Sarah Montgomery from DEFRA. You spoke earlier about the inequality in the domestic workload, and I wondered if you had any tips on how you might restore that balance.
I am the last person. I am notorious for not knowing much about and not being very good at domestic chores. Maybe that's part of the secret of my success, I don't know. At an earlier stage of my political career, there was the fruit bowl scandal because I was pictured in my kitchen with a bowl that did not have fruit in it. And any amount of pleading that it was a decorative bowl that looked the best if you could see the bottom didn't make any difference. The people I've worked with have been known to joke the only thing Julia makes for dinner is reservations. So I'm really not well placed to help you with the domestic stuff, other than I think we sweat a lot of small stuff, both at home and at work, in a way we don't need to. I think most people's homes, you know, because you can see pretty pictures doesn't mean your own home needs to look like that. If it's comfortable and you can live in it, job done. You know, there aren't things with four legs other than dogs and cats that you want to be there, kind of job done.
Great. I think there's a question there. Could you pass the mic? This lady here, did you have a question? Sorry. Thanks.
Hi, Genevieve Aitchison from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. It's a question about how we ensure we get gender equality at the top and also don't lose focus on the pipeline. So I was surprised a while ago in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that we had gender parity on the board, but still not at the kind of middle grades.
Right. So gender parity at the bottom and at the top, but not in the middle.
So we didn't have gender parity in the senior civil service, but we did on the board.
Right.
But yeah, so how we make sure that whilst we're focusing on gender equality at the top, we don't kind of skip the middle, and we make sure we've got a pipeline so that if we do put in place ways to say, okay, we're only going to promote women at this grade, we make sure we don't need that for too long. We keep having a pipeline.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that's a problem that you see in many organisations. I'm not familiar, obviously, with your very particular circumstances, but it seems to me that it's quite common to have, gender equal intake at the graduate level or whatever the intake grades are. Quite common for it to be gender equal. Often at the more senior grades, there is a concern, there are policies about gender diversity, and so you get lateral recruitments. But what's happened is that you've lost women in the middle, and that will often, I think, career progression-wise, correlate with the likely family formation stage. And so clearly that means not enough has been done to enable retention of those women during that stage of their lives. I also think there's often not enough mentorship, sponsorship that enables women to see during that period, when it is a struggle juggle to keep it all together, that if they stay in that workplace, that their prospects of then coming through are good prospects. So I think people, don't get nurtured and supported enough. The flexibilities aren't enough. They might be available on paper, but not in reality. So that causes people to exit, and then perhaps their sense of belief that they will come through if they stay isn't strong enough. So I'd be trying to work on all of those things.
Great. Take another one. Yes, gentleman here.
Hi there, Julia. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Really good to hear you speak. Thinking about gender equality at the top of the civil service, I'm also thinking about what kinds of women are underrepresented at the top. And I'm just wondering whether the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is looking at gender equality from an intersectional perspective and looking at race and class and those different kinds of factors that make up women and what prevents them from accessing the senior civil service.
Yes. Yes, we are, and in the various work and analysis we do, we are trying to always surface the issues about intersectionality and what the differences are, and some of my podcast discussions have been very focused on that too. In the report that we've done with FDA, because it's on these structures of flexible work, that hasn't been particularly an intersectional analysis. But you're right that if we don't unpack this at every level, then a lot can get missed. And at the end of the day, the cause about equality, including equality in leadership, is not one just about white women who either had privileged backgrounds or got access to opportunity. Like myself, came from not a family of high education, but a family of an achievement culture, and got to go to great state schools. And I was of the era in Australia that you got free access to university. So by the time you stack those things up, I mightn't have gone to Eton, but in the world in which we live, I did get dealt a handful of aces. I'm very well aware of that. So we do want to keep a focus on that always.
Great. Fiona, I think we'll have some questions.
See if my microphone is on. Yes, there we go. Thank you. So our questions from our audience. I have one here from Syra Hamilton. As a politician, what was the quality you valued most in your civil servants? I always wanted people who could engage. I'm going to say engage in a conversation as equals, and I'm conscious that there's always going to have to be the formality. So, the civil servants who worked with me in meetings would refer to me as Prime Minister and things like that. But I hated the uncomfortable silences where you knew
people wanted to say something about what you just said, but they felt like they shouldn't. I'd much rather people feel like they can be in the conversation, and whilst it's unlikely that they'd be as blunt as saying, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard, I'd rather them steer towards that end of bluntness than have me try and second guess a yes minister kind of moment. One of my staff, when she first worked with me, when I said something, said, let's just take that and kick it round the park for a while. to which I said, you mean it was really dumb? That's what you mean? She's like, oh. And I said, no, I'd rather you tell me. You know, because if I'm going to say something dumb or do something dumb, I'd rather 2 or 3 people in a room tell me I'm about to do it than, 25 million Australians go, boy, that was dumb. So that degree of honesty in a culture of respect, but that degree of honesty rather than feeling stopped from putting forward what are very important points for a politician to hear.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Dr. Lizzie Houghton. Is there a crisis on toxic masculinity in global politics today? And more importantly, what can be done about it? I'm not a user of the phrase toxic masculinity. I understand what people mean by it, but I think it's one of those phrases that may well be on its way to obscuring more than it reveals. But I too was particularly troubled when we seemed to be in it happened sort of meeting after meeting, we seemed to be in a moment where international relations had degenerated to how hard one man could crush another man's hand when they shook hands. You feel like, why don't we just go back to sending out our best gladiator and, the 2 of them can, and one survives and that's are we really back there? So it does worry me that all of that seems to have resurfaced again. I think to unpack that would require us to have a long session on, the current kind of problems in democracies which are shared. Yours has got a particular set of circumstances around it, but really the sort of post, this era of social media, accelerated messaging, populism, the inability for facts to apparently sustain arguments, leading to all sorts of unusual behaviours in politics. This is a shared crisis, and I think we're all going to have to rethink how we strengthen democratic structures in this age. Long term, I'm an optimist. Short term, I think there's some pretty choppy water to still go through. One more. Do you think a workplace can be truly flexible if it doesn't take age issues into account? And thinking specifically about women and their rise into leadership positions without flexibility for them as they go through the menopause?
Look, I think flexibilities at work need to take account of all different sorts of life circumstances, and men and women at different stages of their life will experience things that mean that's a better era for them in terms of how they feel, how they engage in their workplace. It's a worse era. I'm turning 58 on Sunday, as I told you in my speech. When you get to my age, you look across your male and female friends, and you can count the people who have had battles with cancer, the people who have lost their battles with cancer, the people who have had other health issues that have taken them out of the workplace or meant that they needed flexibilities at any particular moment. I don't think that's gendered, I think that's shared, and we should, because people are living longer lives, be making have on the agenda that flexibilities are about retaining people as they age, as well as every other way. It's obviously a very bad waste of talent if health issues in people's 50s or early 60s mean that they exit the workforce early and don't go on for what would be the remainder of a very productive career. And, you know, given how the world is, I think many people will want to work at least part-time into their early 70s and perhaps beyond.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we've got time for perhaps one, maybe two more questions from the floor. So do people want to, so one back there, and then perhaps we'll go there. All right, sorry. Well, I'll tell you what we'll do. Why don't we do three together so that we're fair, and then you can answer them. If that makes sense. Okay,
G'day and kia ora, cousin from across the channel. Thank you for speaking tonight. My question is actually about your chairing of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, which I think is an amazing thing, and you've partially in your last question answered part of mine. I want to focus on the global aspect of it, in that I do a lot of campaigning for disability rights, not just from a gender point of view, but also from a wider global ethnicity point of view as well. And I'm curious as to, in the Institute's role in looking at gender equality at the top, how are you going to start tackling where we come a proper on ethnicities who do not perhaps even believe in women reaching the top, but let alone those of either gender or no gender at all that have disabilities? Just very quickly, I'll give you an example. Working in the public sector, when I decided to have a baby, not only was it, oh, you're having a baby, I didn't think you could because I'm disabled, but also the next question that came out of their mouth is, have you had a scan to make sure it's okay? Yeah. And you know, how do we get rid of those sorts of prejudices?
Do you want to do that one first, and then we'll take the other two together? Sure.
The Global Institute for Women's Leadership had its first birthday in April this year, so we're still very young, and we haven't at this stage done any research work on gender and disability. That might lie in our future, but we haven't done it yet. We have thought, though, of the country comparatives, and we do want to be gathering and publishing global data sets which will enable people to see which countries are doing which things well and which are doing them badly. That feeds into a good discussion. People like seeing that kind of information crystallised. It makes countries want to be amongst the leaders rather than clearly down the bottom. It also enables the surfacing of best practice, and sometimes you can find that in, you know, places that wouldn't normally be on the come to your mind as, oh, if I want to study X policy issue, I should definitely look at Y country. Often you'll surface them in unusual places. So we are hoping to do a fair bit of that kind of global comparative work.
Brilliant, thank you. There was a question up there, the same row. Yes, great. And then could we also get the mic into the middle there? Did you have a question? Do you want to put your hand up and then we'll get the mic? Okay.
Hi, my name's Leila Kelly. I'm with the Government Legal Department and also with the FDA Executive Committee. We're celebrating 100 years of women in the law in the UK, and I wanted to talk about that recently. And they were talking about the scrutiny that women leaders come under because you are the only one. So everything you do is scrutinised. You spoke about that quite powerfully. One of the speakers said that she thought that the only answer is to get more women or people from different ethnic groups into leadership, and that the answer might be quotas. And I wondered whether you had a view on that.
Yeah, I am. I don't think quotas are the answer everywhere, every time, but I think that they're an important potential tool in the toolbox, and you've got to work out if it's going to solve the problem you're trying to solve. From my own experience, we talked before about the affirmative action target. For the Australian Labor Party, that worked. So if you look back in the early 1990s when we were campaigning for this target to be adopted, at that stage in the National Parliament in Australia, both the Conservative side of politics and the Labor side of politics, were around 14% women, 14%. So bad. If you look at where we are now, and our quota has gone, it started at 30% and then it's gone up and up. If you look at where we are now, we're at 46% women in the Labor Party, but the Conservatives have gone to about 23%. Now, the Conservatives said no quotas, it's anti-merit and all of that kind of stuff, and went instead for sort of networking and mentoring models. And I honestly just look at that and say, kind of scoreboard, it's clear that you needed to change the structure of pre-selection in order to get more women through. And I think the merit argument is, at the end of the day, a silly one. If you do believe that merit is equally distributed between the sexes, and I do, then you should be able to look at any institution and see around half men, half women. And knowing the women who have come into the parliament in all those years in between, since the 1990s, I can tell you for sure that the affirmative action rule has raised the standard of political representation for the Labor Party in the National Parliament without a shadow of a doubt. We are a stronger political party because of the affirmative action rule. Will it work everywhere, every time? Things have to be customised, thought through, but I certainly think quotas and targets can make a very big difference.
Okay, great. Final question, I think, Dan.
Thank you. This has been a really interesting and civilised conversation about equality. I hate to say it, but I think that's in large part because most of the people here, I assume, are already convinced that equality is a good value. It's also a less combative environment than social media and politics, which you are well versed in. And my question is, how do we discuss these issues, never mind make the case for them, without getting drowned out by the noise of those Twitter storms and the hurly-burly of a combative parliament system?
That's a really good question, and I think a lot of campaigning actually comes down to meeting people where they are and to storytelling. I do think we can get overly hung up on, terminology and things that people don't understand. I mean, I do sometimes sit in rooms and think, I'm not even sure I'm following all of the acronyms in this conversation. I don't know how anybody else would be. I think we've got to, have a conversation that people can participate in, and that conversation really needs to be about, people's wives, people's sisters, people's daughters, women that they care about in their lives. Their prospects, their hopes for the future. And I think if you break it down like that, then the equality argument is just so overpowering that people will go with it. And having spent, as many years as I did knocking on doors and standing at street stalls and all the rest of it, you'd only ever be able to break down prejudices if you could find that one connection point with people's lives. So you'd have someone say to you, oh, there's too much immigration, we should tell all of these immigrants to go home. And if you met that with, you're a racist or something like that, then it's just going to escalate up. You'd have to stand there at the street stall and say, oh, and what's your name? And tell me a bit about yourself. And you get them talking, and then, finally they might say, oh, and I've got a wedding on this weekend. My niece is getting married. Oh, who's she getting married to? Oh, she's marrying an Italian. You go, right, I've got it. He's a good bloke, is he? The Italian, like he's a good bloke. Oh yeah, he's a pretty good bloke. He's a plumber. Well, and then you're able to say, well, your niece, a good bloke, an Italian. Well, just goes to show, like some of the people who come to this country, like they're making a real contribution, and obviously your niece is in love, and then you can, then come back to the bigger argument. It takes that amount of patience, and sometimes I think as campaigners we don't show it, and we need to. I met, when I was in Seoul, a campaigner from Ireland who'd campaigned on the same-sex marriage referendum, obviously very successful. And he told this wonderful story about how one of the MPs who was out there most strongly campaigning for same-sex marriage would always get confused with all of the initials, and so was frequently out giving speeches saying, what we've got to do is get rights for the BLTs. And, you know, like, it would be better if he got it right, but, you know, at the end of the day, if he's saying that and people are hearing him to mean that everybody should be treated with equality, like, have we gone that far wrong? We probably haven't. So I just think we've got to be a little bit more open about how we let these campaigning conversations happen.
What a brilliant note to end on. I have to say, it is fantastic to see a woman who's made it right to the top actually now spends time focusing on this and delivering something for everyone else. I mean, as gender champion for the civil service, it's brilliant. The work you're doing on flexible working is terrific. And I think we're all going to thank you now, and then I'm going to ask Fiona to come up to the stage. So thank you, it's been wonderful.
Thank you.
My goodness, what a wonderful evening and a fantastic event. Thank you both very much. I hope you will agree with me that it really has been a fantastic evening and really interesting as well, just to hear about the challenges and obstacles that you faced, and also your views about how others can overcome that as we go forward. I'd like to say a very big thank you to everyone at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership for all the support that they have given to colleagues in FDA, and also an enormous thank you to our wonderful FDA team, everybody at headquarters. An enormous amount of effort has gone into organising this event for you all here in the room, and also for our sort of Twitter joiners and our people in Edinburgh. So it has involved a huge amount of work, and I'm extremely grateful to everybody who's made it possible for this evening. And now we would like to invite you to join us. We have some refreshments which are on offer in the arcade. The arcade, I think people will be ushered in the right direction of where to get to. We'd like it very much if you would join us there. I think the exits at the back are the best ones to go out of. But in the meantime, if you would please just join with me again in thanking everybody involved this evening.